Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're playing everyone's favorite game, Draft or Pass. This is going to be part 2 of the series as I filtered through a multitude of players answering this singular question as to whether or not we are drafting or passing on them going into our 2022 fantasy football leagues. Now, in order to make this more interesting, I've gone ahead and added a condition to every single player's current status. Some will make them more appealing, others less. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because, again, going into any single draft, I would draft any player at the right price, at the right value, in the correct round. But if I add more context in regards to their current status, whether you're drafting them as a potential RB2, wide receiver 1, your tight end 1, it may give you a little bit more of an understanding as to what my opinions are regarding those players. Now, besides the condition itself, I will be giving you guys statistics that justify the reasons as to whether or not I am drafting or passing these players as we progress throughout today's video. Now, to give you a quick example and kind of roll you through one, let's talk about Justin Jefferson going into the 2022 fantasy football season. His current ADP on Underdog Fantasy is at 3.3. Obviously, he's the third or fourth pick off the board consistently. Now, his current condition would be he'd have to be your number 1 wide receiver on roster, your wide receiver 1. Now, obviously, we are all unanimous in the idea that, yes, we would be extremely comfortable having Justin Jefferson as our wide receiver 1 on roster because what he has done over the course of the first 2 seasons of his career, averaging 17.53 half PPR fantasy points per game in the contests in which he had Kirk Cousins under center and Justin Jefferson himself played 75% of the snaps or more. That's 27 out of the last 33 games. That's 81% of the time in which he's been averaging such a high clip of fantasy points. Now, obviously, we all love the situation, so we'd give him a like, and we move on to the next player. Now, in order to give you an example as to what would be considered a pass, let's talk about the next player, Robbie Anderson. Going into 2022, there's a lot of confusion as to what this offense is going to look like. Obviously, they have an upgrade at the quarterback position, going to Baker Mayfield, named the starter. That's great and all, but Robbie Anderson still finished as the number 50 wide receiver last year. And with his current condition of being the number 1 wide receiver on my roster, we would not feel comfortable with that. So we would all say no and pass on the matter. But as we progress throughout today's video, the situations aren't going to be as easy as yes on Justin Jefferson and no on Robbie Anderson. I, in fact, traveled into the comment section of our prior draft or pass video, took a lot of the suggestions and all the players that you guys mentioned that you wanted to see, and I've included them in today's episode. I'll be sure to give you guys shout outs for those of you who commented on those players, but it will be a little bit more difficult, which makes it that much easier for you to understand the context regarding the player and whether or not you should be drafting them in your 2022 fantasy football leagues. Now, speaking of drafting, for those of you who are trying to gain an edge on your league mates and continue to draft this offseason and gain experience in the difficult decision-making processes, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. If you travel to the description of the video and click on the link and use promo code Andrew today, when you make a first-time deposit, not only will you get a deposit match up to $100, but you'll also get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings for a half and full PPR scoring format. Let me give you more context on the matter. My draft rankings, half and full PPR, include by tier rankings at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defensive positions, along with my top 200 flex. If you sign up using promo code Andrew and make a first-time deposit, within 24 hours, I will send you a personal email with those draft rankings. And not only will you get those rankings, but I will subsequently be sending you weekly updated rankings up until September 3rd, so that regardless of when you're drafting this offseason, you have my updated rankings and you're ready to succeed in your 2022 fantasy football leagues. Hopefully you'll enjoy that. Check that out today. Last thing I wanted to mention before we proceed, if you have not already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. If you're trying to gain another edge on your league mates, be sure to subscribe as I'll be making content in order to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. All right, let's go ahead and let's progress to the first player I wanted to mention, Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, I saw this name once in the comment section in our prior video. It was commented by All Might Sosa 300. Shout out. Thank you for doing this. So the question in regards to Travis Etienne is whether or not he can be the RB2 on our roster and us be comfortable in the idea of having him as our RB2. That is the current condition. Currently has an ADP of 36.2 on Underdog Fantasy. And again, I feel relatively comfortable having Travis Etienne as my RB2. Though I'm always in the conversation of grabbing 2 running backs within my first 3 rounds, if I'm able to get Travis Etienne at his current ADP, sitting at the back end of the 3rd round, if I've already gone ahead and selected perhaps a running back and Travis Kelce in my first 2 picks, I think Travis Etienne could be a fantastic RB2 option going into the 2022 season. Again, let's not forget, coming out of college at Clemson, I mean, his overall stats were unbelievable. 4,900 rushing yards throughout his career at Clemson, over 70 rushing touchdowns, over 1,000 receiving yards, over 100 receptions throughout the span of 2017 through 2020. Obviously, in his rookie year in the NFL, had that Liz Frank injury in the preseason, which pretty much knocked him out for the entire year. And obviously, going into 2022, the whole question is he, fully healthy? Can he be unlocked in this offense? And are we going to see James Robinson potentially come back from that Achilles injury and take away value? I am not so concerned about James Robinson. I think Travis Etienne is purely going to be the primary back of this team, especially on third downs, as he has the ability to catch the ball and already has that built-in rapport with Trevor Lawrence. So going into 2022, I'm extremely comfortable having him as my RB2. He's a player that I potentially want to go after if he drops to the 4th round. I doubt it happens in many scenarios, but I've personally seen it happen, which is why I would go after Travis Etienne. And even if that means drafting my 3rd running back within my first 4 rounds, I'd still be comfortable taking Travis Etienne at that point. Moving on, let's talk about our next player, A.J. Dillon of the Green Bay Packers. Now, this suggestion was made by Zul down in the comment section. He asked, Andrew, A.J. Dillon and the condition being an RB2 status. Now, this one's a little bit tricky. Obviously, A.J. Dillon is a good running back. We know this, but at the current ADP of 62.5, grabbing your RB2 at that point, you obviously have some inherent risk built in. Obviously, last year, we had A.J. Dillon come off a year in which he had, 224 total opportunities, that meaning rushing attempts and targets combined, that led to 221 total touches. Great amount of work. But the real reason why he was given such a huge uptick in opportunity was mainly because of Aaron Jones' injury that he sustained late last season. Now, against the Seattle Seahawks, many of us don't remember, but Aaron Jones went down with a knee injury. Because of that, A.J. Dillon completely kind of swapped roles with him and began being the primary back in terms of overall touches. Now, from weeks 1 through 9 of last year, Aaron Jones was averaging 16.5 touches per game, while A.J. Dillon was averaging only 10 per game. Then when we get to weeks 10 through 17, Aaron Jones was only averaging 12.33 touches per game, while A.J. Dillon jumped up to the 16.5 touches per game category. Now, obviously, due to that knee injury, Aaron Jones slowed down a little bit, wasn't given as much opportunity, wasn't given as much of a snap share in the offense. And anytime we saw A.J. Dillon elevate himself to playing more than 45% of the offensive snaps, in the 7 games he participated in his career, he's averaged 16.51 fantasy points per game. There's a lot of potential in A.J. Dillon. I mean, we've seen this offense want to continue to try to go in that direction, but can we trust him as an immediate RB2? I'm not at the position yet to think, man, A.J. Dillon, without a doubt, can very easily score upwards of 8 touchdowns on a consistent basis this year, surpass over 1,000 rushing yards, and get himself into that 30 reception conversation easily. I think it's going to be a definite difficult task at hand, even despite the fact that Davante Adams is no longer in this offense. I know the stats regarding running backs when Davante Adams hasn't played since 2019 are nice. I mean, in the 8 games that Davante Adams has either left early or didn't play altogether because of an injury, the running back position averaged 38.33 fantasy points per game and a half PPR in those contests as a combined total backfield. Again, that's 24.63 attempts per game, 8.8 receptions per game. There's a lot of touches to be had when Davante Adams is not in the lineup. And obviously we may see that, be the case in 2022. But as of right now, it's going to be tough for me to go after A.J. Dillon and make him my RB2 and trust that every single week he's going to be given more than 12 touches per game. Because if he's not able to get himself a high yardage total or score a touchdown, we're going to be in a little bit of trouble. Now, in terms of some different alternatives that you may have to go after in that same range, I think I'd feel far more comfortable going after guys like Josh Jacobs, who at the similar ADP should be an available option, a player that is a starting running back of his team and is in a high-functioning offense that should be able to consistently score points on a weekly basis, giving him more and more red zone opportunities. Let's not forget, over the last couple years, we have seen Aaron Jones be a touchdown machine, scoring 40 out of his last 45 games. When that's the case, it's tough for me to 100% believe in A.J. Dillon as an RB2. We'll move on. Let's talk about A.J. Brown. Okay, so A.J. Brown's in an interesting scenario here. He's going from being the number 1 wide receiver of the Tennessee Titans, a run-first offense, to being the number 1 wide receiver of a Philadelphia Eagles offense, which was a team that had the second most rushing attempts amongst all teams last year, only behind the Titans. So it's going to be a very similar concept where The running game is the priority, and A.J. Brown is going to have to fill in the rest of the gaps. Now, when I traveled to the comment section and saw that A.J. Brown's name was posted in 3 different sections, Scooby J, Thacula, and Buffalo Confidential, I thought, okay, this is interesting. A lot of people want to hear about A.J. Brown and his potential status of having a condition of being a wide receiver 1 on your team. Now, though I think A.J. Brown could very easily be your wide receiver 1, considering the fact that he currently has a 3rd round draft ADP, you'd be drafting him probably after confirming a running back in your 1st and 2nd rounds. I think he is a player that I'm far more comfortable having at the back end of the 3rd round, because the alternative options of a Michael Pittman Jr., a T. Higgins, Mike Williams, Keenan Allen are far more appealing to me in a sense that, okay, at least we know that there's more potential upside in the passing game for a Colts, a Bengals, a Chargers offense. And even Keenan Allen has been so consistent throughout his career that he can get into that conversation and pose as a more viable option going into 2022. But let's not forget, A.J. Brown, 2019 through 2021 with Tannehill under center, averaged 14.26 fantasy points per game. That's 23 touchdowns in the 35 games that they played together. Going into 2022, Jalen Hurts and A.J. Brown, they seem to be best friends. The last time we saw a best friend combination was Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford coming together in a given year and them having a fantastic season. I think a lot of people are sleeping on the fact that A.J. Brown has an incredibly high upside, and he has the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position. Speaking of strength of schedules, tomorrow will be the running back position. The following day will be wide receiver. Hopefully you'll check those out. But as of right now, I'm comfortable having him as a wide receiver 1 on my team. Assuming it's at the back end of the 3rd round, we're good there. Outside of that, I'd much rather have all the other options I previously mentioned, because they personally, in my opinion, give me a little bit more upside and a little bit more to trust in 2022. All right, moving on. We have Amari Cooper as another player that was suggested down in the comment section. Again, I think right now, Amari Cooper is a player that is in a tricky situation. He's obviously still going to be capable of putting up wide receiver, I would say top 36 numbers for the first 11 weeks of the season with Jacoby Brissett. But after we get past that, the question is, can we survive long enough with Amari Cooper as a wide receiver 3 option to then wait for Deshaun Watson to return and help elevate his game? At where you're having to draft him and the value that you'll get for majority of the season is really risky. Again, the first 11 weeks of the season are going to revolve around Jacoby Brissett trying to get him the ball. And though Jacoby Brissett has helped wide receivers achieve, top 36 standing, if you go back to the 2017 season with the Colts, T.Y. Hilton had himself, nearly 1,000 yards, 4 touchdowns, 75 grabs, was a decent wide receiver there. We even saw Jacoby Brissett last season help Jalen Waddle get a bunch of work in the receiving game, but he's going to have to continuously throw the ball in their direction on a consistent pace. And over the course of the last couple of years, we've certainly seen Amari Cooper deliver on high opportunity counts. But as a wide receiver 3, I think I'm comfortable enough with the idea that he could be a top 36 wide receiver with Jacoby Brissett, to the point that when he ends up getting Deshaun Watson back from weeks 12 on, he could be a player that in the fantasy football playoffs could very easily win us a championship. So I'm going to go ahead and as a wide receiver 3, like and draft Amari Cooper, because what we've seen with Deshaun Watson's number 1 wide receivers over the course of 2017 through 2020, DeAndre Hopkins throughout that time was the number 5 wide receiver overall in 2019 and was the number 2 wide receiver overall in 2018, averaging over 16 fantasy points per game. 2017 through 2020, Will Fuller with Deshaun Watson averaged 20.25 fantasy points per game. And from weeks 1 through 12 of the 2020 season prior to Will Fuller's suspension was the number 5 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. You even go past that. Brandon Cooks in 2020, when they played together, weeks 5 through 17 of the 2020 season, Brandon Cooks was averaging 15.7 fantasy points per game and was the number 6 overall wide receiver in that time span. There is a lot of potential when you have elite quarterback play, and that's why we're trusting in Amari Cooper as a wide receiver 3. All right, let's talk about Mac Jones. Somebody went ahead and suggested Mac Jones in a little bit of a different context. Danny Phillips said the condition has to be Mac Jones would be your starter in a 2 QB league. Would you be comfortable with that? Now, at this moment, I'm thinking to myself, if I'm playing in a 2 QB league, I think the only quarterback that I'm willing to have as my second quarterback on roster, and after that, it's a huge drop-off in terms of the tiers, would be Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan is currently my number 16th ranked quarterback. So that means I want 2 top 16 quarterbacks as my starting QBs in a 2 QB league. especially if it's a 6-point per passing touchdown format. So in regards to Mac Jones being a starter in a 2 QB league, I'm completely out on that idea. I'd feel far more comfortable with Mac Jones being my third overall quarterback on roster, the player that I can potentially use to exploit matchups and fill in for bye weeks. So as of right now, I'm comfortable there. Outside of that, as my second quarterback, not comfortable. Like I mentioned before, I'd much rather have a Matt Ryan, Aaron Rodgers as my second quarterback, maybe even get into the conversation of playing Tua as my second quarterback. But Mac Jones, considering the offensive struggles that they may see considering the offensive coordinator change, I'm out on that idea. Moving on to Tyler Boyd. Okay, Tyler Boyd's in an interesting situation, and his current condition is being a wide receiver 5 on your roster. First and foremost, that's an automatic. And the reason why I say that is because when you're associated with the Bengals offense going into 2022, there is an extreme amount of upside, considering the fact that, of course, defenses have to go ahead and try to stop Mixon, Chase, and Higgins. And after they figure that out, they still have to deal with Tyler Boyd, who has been an extremely consistent fantasy option. I mean, last year was a top 36 wide receiver in fantasy football. He produced 4 top 16 weeks, 8 weeks of a top 36 standing, and then the other 8 weeks that he ended up producing were outside of the top 40. So yes, he's been inconsistent, but that being said, there's a lot of potential for Tyler Boyd in 2022, mainly because if there's any situation in which a Bengals wide receiver is to miss a given amount of time with an injury, he fills in as a handcuff option. Not only does he have singular value as an option in this offense that could fill in on a bye week as a wide receiver 3 option because, a great matchup, exploiting that, etc., but because if in fact we see T. Higgins or Jamar Chase miss time, like we saw last year, T. Higgins missed weeks 3 and 4 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Throughout that span of time, in those 2 weeks, Tyler Boyd has 17 targets that led to 13 receptions, 154 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown. That's 27.9 half PPR fantasy points, nearly 14 fantasy points per game without one of the 2 primary receivers in that offense. So if this offense ever gets to that point, he's a perfect handcuff, and even without the handcuff option, can certainly put up top 36 weeks and help you as a wide receiver 3 player in 2022. Moving on, Christian Kirk. Now, I think I mentioned this yesterday on the live stream in regards to Christian Kirk and me being a little bit too low on his value. In my current rankings, I think I have him too low because what we saw in the last couple days in terms of what Trevor Lawrence has been able to do, funneling wide receiver targets in the direction of Zay Jones and then now most recently Christian Kirk in the last 2 preseason games, makes me think that this offense has definitely evolved in comparison to what Urban Meyer had it at. Of course, you bring in Doug Peterson. There's a reason why there's so much confidence behind Travis Etienne, because this offense is going to be able to throw the ball, spread out defenses, and be able to run the ball consistently on a weekly basis. So let's talk about his current condition. He's going to be a potential wide receiver 4 on your roster. Based on where he's being drafted at an ADP of 82, I feel extremely comfortable drafting him there. Now, shout out to Chang in the comment section who went ahead and suggested Christian Kirk. But as of right now, I'm 100% in on the idea of having him as my wide receiver 4 because in this last weekend's preseason game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 54 yards. Again, they didn't even play the full game, but he was getting funnel targeted, as many balls as they possibly could. There's a reason why in free agency, they went ahead and they paid this man so much money and completely destroyed the wide receiver market. He's coming off of a year with the Arizona Cardinals where he was a top 36 fantasy wide receiver, had career highs in receptions with 77, career high in receiving yards with 982, and will only continue to help develop the young talent of Trevor Lawrence and make Trevor Lawrence look like the number 1 overall pick that he is. I think Christian Kirk is a fantastic option going into 2022, which certainly has a lot of upside in an offense that a lot of people are sleeping on. Moving on to Dallas Goedert. Okay, his current condition is a tight end 1 on roster. Now, this isn't specifically against Dallas Goedert, though I have arguments that kind of go against him. I mainly just want to go after stud top tier tight ends. I never want to be in a situation where I have to, in my later rounds, 8th, 9th, 10th rounds, grab a tight end that I'm not 100% comfortable on and a guy that may not be, putting up 10 fantasy points per week because you're really not going to find value at that point. Now, there certainly are guys that, have averaged, 6 to 8 fantasy points in a season and then the next year they explode and have themselves an incredible year. I mean, we look at Mark Andrews in seasons past, Dalton Schultz this last season, but unless it's Kelsey, Andrews, Pitts, Kittle, Waller, Schultz, I really don't want to deal with any of these other tight ends until way later down the line. So if I'm in a position where I have to grab, Dallas Goedert at the current ADP, I'm completely out on the situation. Mainly because Dallas Goedert isn't the problem, but what are we really expecting to see from those tight ends throughout that range? Whether it's TJ Hawkinson, Dallas Goedert, Zach Ertz, Dawson Knox, Hunter Henrys of the world, they're all going to be in the same region of fantasy points per game. And because of that, I'm not too interested in investing a higher pick when I can get a later round running back that may end up being the league winner at the end of the season. Again, last year in the 9 games that Jalen Hurts played with Dallas Goedert, and there was no Zach Ertz in the lineup. Unfortunately, Dallas Goedert didn't have a great time. He scored 0 touchdowns, was averaging 3.9 receptions and 56 receiving yards per game, which led to 5.88 fantasy points per game on average. Again, when we're talking about these lower tier tight ends, after we get past the top 6, I'm very disinterested in the idea of investing in them. I'd rather go after sleepers like Irv Smith way down in the line, David Njoku, players in that region that I can get very similar value out of, even guys like Tyler Higbee. But either way, gives you some context. All right, moving on. We have Breece Hall, running back of the New York Jets, currently at an ADP of 42.5. The question is whether we can live with him being our RB2 on roster. That is the current condition. Now, shout out to those of you, Jukester and Andrew W., who suggested this down in the comments section. Let's talk about Breece Hall. Obviously, we talked about him as being a potential breakout candidate this offseason already in a prior video. But again, I want to mention some of the stats that kind of revolve around Breece Hall and his potential to succeed based on the history of running backs selected in the second round as of the last 5 seasons. So since 2017, there have been 13 running backs selected in the second round. Of those 13 running backs, 10 of them didn't deal with massive injuries. So again, Dalvin Cook, season-ending ACL injury his rookie year. Darius Geis didn't play a single game. And Ronald Jones only played, really honestly, 8 games in his rookie year. Half of the time doesn't really constitute a full rookie season. And also missed a huge chunk of the beginning of the year, which obviously made sure that he wasn't on rosters. But nonetheless, of the potential 10 running backs that were eligible that didn't miss time with massive injuries, 8 of them were top 36 running backs in fantasy football, 6 were top 24, and 1 was a top 12 running back. Of course, that top 12 running back that was selected in the second round came most recently in 2020 when Jonathan Taylor was able to succeed and complete that. Now, obviously, going into this upcoming season, we're associating Breece Hall in a backfield that already has Michael Carter and is already an offense that isn't at its most successful at this point. We're talking about the New York Jets running game, which they often abandoned majority of the time last season because of the fact that their game scripts were not in scenarios in which they can continue to compete. So the main prospect of this conversation is, can we trust him as an RB2 at his current 4th round value? I think we can. Let's give you a scenario. What if I start off in the middle of the first round? I end up getting a stud running back like a Dalvin Cook. Follow up in the second round by getting Mark Andrews. Third round, I go and I get my number 1 wide receiver in a player like Mike Williams or, Michael Pittman Jr. And then in the 4th, with all the value that I've gone ahead and assembled via running back, tight end, and wide receiver, I want to go ahead and I want to take a risk on a potential rookie running back that has upside. A guy that is joining a group of running backs over the last 5 seasons that have found a lot of success in fantasy football. 8 of those 10 players, again, being top 36 running backs. The only 2 that weren't able to accomplish that was A.J. Dillon, who again was behind a top-tier running back of course, Aaron Jones, and Jamal Williams was still there. And then the other option was Cam Akers, who obviously dealt with a rib injury early on in the season, missed 3 games because of that, and had to play behind Darrell Henderson and Malcolm Brown. So I don't really see much of an issue here. As long as Breece Hall is staying healthy, I expect him to be in that top 24 running back range in an easy RB2 play. That's why we're liking him and drafting him this upcoming season. Moving on, we have Allen Robinson. Now, Allen Robinson, he was mentioned by James in the chat and Buffalo Confidential. They asked whether or not we should be comfortable drafting him under the condition of being a wide receiver 2. I'm willing to draft him as a wide receiver 1. Okay, I'm at that point. Now, I may be alone in that idea, mainly because a lot of people don't see the potential of what this Rams offense presents. And, perhaps you don't remember how great Allen Robinson was. I know Allen Robinson hurt many of us. Okay, last year was brutal, especially considering where we drafted him as a top 12 wide receiver option. Again, a guy that was the number 11 wide receiver in half PPR in 2019 and in 2020 was the number 12 overall wide receiver. I understand We got burnt last season. But think about the offense. Think about the quarterback play. This is the best situation that Allen Robinson has ever been in. He's been able to be a top 12 wide receiver with Blake Bortles and Mitchell Trubisky in his career. So why not with Matthew Stafford? Why not in a situation where, of course, when you look at what Bobby Trees, Robert Woods was able to do prior to his injury last year, he was the number 11 overall wide receiver in fantasy football, averaging 12.74 fantasy points per game. As soon as he got injured and left, they brought in OBJ. OBJ from weeks 12 through 17 was the number 13 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. If we went ahead and combined OBJ and Robert Woods' stats last season and made a singular wide receiver out of that, combination, they would have totaled for 117 targets, 72 catches, 861 yards, 9 receiving touchdowns, 188.70 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, which would have been the number 20 overall wide receiver. I personally think that Allen Robinson could even excel past that in terms of targets, in terms of opportunity, and scoring even more fantasy points. With that being mentioned, again, a wide receiver 2 is an automatic. For some of us, like myself, you may be more comfortable grabbing him as a wide receiver 1. For example, at his current ADP of like 39.9, right? 40. If you're getting him at the 40th overall selection and you've gone ahead and set yourself up with RB, tight end, RB, and grabbing, Allen Robinson at the beginning of the 4th round, I'm pretty comfortable there. But either way, as wide receiver 2, I think it's a given success for 2022. Moving on, let's talk about a kicker. Now, though, kickers aren't drafted in Underdog Fantasy, thank goodness, because we don't want to deal with kickers. Many of us still have kickers in our respective home leagues. And the reason why I wanted to mention him, specifically Justin Tucker, at the condition of being drafted in the 13th round is because we have to understand that you shouldn't be overdrafting kickers. Now, I have seen in many scenarios, whether it's my leagues or other leagues, that people will go ahead and they will draft kickers, especially when they're not given extra bonus points, at a far earlier rate than they should be. And that, in my opinion, is something I want to avoid at all costs. So at the current condition of being drafted in the 13th round, at a current ADP on Sleeper of 157, I even went to Yahoo. He has an ADP of 150 plus. Overall, I think to myself, man, drafting Justin Tucker at that position when I can get another stud player that may end up being a sleeper option for me later in the season, when I could just as easily draft a kicker way later down the line who's going to get me similar points. Now, the reason why I say this is because since 2017, Justin Tucker has ranked as the number 5, 2, 3, 8, and 6 overall kicker in fantasy football in a standard scoring format, putting up 151, 151, 143, 136, and 149 fantasy points in each of those individual years. Now, in my opinion, instead of overdrafting a kicker, I'm going after running back handcuffs. I'm going after talent that is at the rookie wide receiver position that may end up exploding later on in the season. And I'd feel far more comfortable waiting on kicker, drafting guys like Greg Joseph, who's going to be associated with a stud, top tier Vikings offense that is going to be scoring a bunch of points. I feel more comfortable drafting Rodrigo Blankenship. I know he was injured for a majority of last year, but a lot of people don't remember. This guy's got a leg on him, and they're going to continue to score a lot of points in Indianapolis. Not even that. Let's talk about Brandon McManus, a guy that really hasn't been a fantasy option at the kicker position, considering Denver's offenses of the past haven't been great. You bring in Russell Wilson, that offense is going to accelerate to the next level. So instead of drafting, specifically overdrafting your kickers, I'm telling you, you can wait and grab studs way later down the line. Last thing I wanted to mention is handcuffs. Now, though I have used Nyheim Hines in this regard, the reason why I wanted to talk about Nyheim Hines under the condition of being a 10th round selection is because a player like Nyheim Hines is not only a handcuff. He is a handcuff with upside, and you don't really find many of those players in fantasy football. You'll see that, every now and then. And going into this upcoming year, a lot of people see Brian Robinson in that role. We see Khalil Herbert, Isaiah Spiller, running backs that are associated with offenses that are going to give them touches, that give them potential weekly flex opportunity, but also they're immediate handcuffs in the idea that if their starter goes down, these are players that could very easily be top 15 running backs in fantasy football because of the given opportunity that is at hand. So why do I feel really comfortable drafting Nyheim Hines in the 10th round? Obviously, his current ADP is at that point, but you should be looking to draft him because that's where, the handcuff position pretty much comes off the board. Nyheim Hines, Alexander Mattison, Donta Foreman, players that are associated with top-tier running backs should be selected at this point. Now, you could potentially go with the alternatives. You could go after Kenneth Gainwell. You could go after Darrell Henderson and see, if Miles Sanders gets injured, if, Cam Akers doesn't look as good as the Rams initially thought during the season and he slows down, you could go after other handcuffs in those situations. But in my opinion, having a handcuff of a top-tier player like Jonathan Taylor, in order to have the insurance on that player, especially if I am a Jonathan Taylor manager. In terms of a Nyheim Hines, 10th round, hopefully this gives you a little bit more context into my thought process in regards to running backs who are handcuffs and have potential flex opportunities. All right, that concludes today's video. I want to thank you guys for watching. Of course, if you have not yet already subscribed, be sure to do so today. We're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 fantasy football season. Be sure to like, and of course, go down to the comment section and let me know any other players you'd like me to cover in a potential part 3 for the draft or pass series. Outside of that, check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew today. Again, when you do so and you make a first-time deposit, you not only get a deposit match up to $100, you'll get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings sent in your direction within 24 hours. Be sure to check your spam or junk folders because usually they end up there. Anyway, thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.